Thank you, Nick and Paul, for joining us today to talk about your Inclusive Design Challenge proposal. I was hoping you guys could start off by, telling me a little bit about yourself. Who are you, and how did you get interested or involved in accessibility technology? Nick?
Sure. So my name is Nicholas Giudice. I'm a professor in spatial computing at the University of Maine, and I founded and now co-run the VME Lab, which is where this work is coming out of. So yeah, I've been interested in accessibility research before I even knew what accessibility research is. Because as a congenitally blind guy, I realized how challenging it is to access graphical and non-textual information very early on in school. There's text to speech for lots of things that will let you hear, words on a screen. But when there's graphics or maps or things like that, that's very difficult. So I started doing a lot of work in my PhD and then as an early professor in accessible STEM, and I've continued that line of research. But another area that I've been very interested in is, again, driven by practical necessity, navigation and getting around. And someone that doesn't drive, uh, at least anything that we can talk about here on a public forum, um, and being in a state where transportation networks are kind of limited, it's really challenging to figure out how to get from place to place when you want, where you want, without kind of either taking lots of, having to rely on friends or having to rely heavily on cabs. And so I've been interested in autonomous vehicles and the concept of autonomous vehicles for years, just because this is a solution that would provide a lot of, a huge amount of utility in solving the problem of getting from A to B, which is, such a key part of our independence. When you think about getting through life and the things that we do on a daily basis, they involve navigating, and they often involve navigating, beyond where you might want to walk. Or maybe it's cold. We live in Maine. It's cold and snowy lots of the year. So um, became interested in this work a couple of years ago, and what we can do in the autonomous vehicle space. And what we realized very quickly is that the vast majority of information that's out there is on engineering factors. So things like control algorithms and sensory fusion, and keeping the car on the road and having it not hit things, and things that we obviously want to be done. But there's way less out there on the human factors and the relation of the human agent that's going to be in the car and how they'll connect with the AI agent, or essentially the computer that will be driving fully autonomous vehicles, where essentially everyone is going to be a passenger. It's, whether you're blind or not, you're going to be driven by these computers. And so we became interested in how do we get better connections between humans and AI in this area we call human vehicle collaboration, because it is a collaboration. Essentially, it's not just connecting with your, communicating with your Alexa to play the song you want or to get the recipe you want, but you're operating now at high speeds in life or death situations, and you need to be able to communicate with your vehicle. How do we do that effectively? And the one thing that we know from the human vehicle literature is that humans don't trust these things. So we know they're coming. There's a huge amount of capital expenditure, but there's very little trust from the human side, and there's not a lot of research on how to solve that. So we became interested in this connection, and then we also realized, well, wow, the what's out there now is pretty much completely visually based touchscreens and inaccessible interfaces. I was in a friend's Tesla, which is just a semi-autonomous vehicle, but I couldn't even get the radio on. So, this if you're going to operate these things and you aren't going to be able to see, or you're going to be an older adult that may not have familiarity with this type of technology, we need to come up with new ways of communicating with the vehicle. And so that's how we got started. And then this project said, well, it's not just communicating when you're in the vehicle, but how do you find the vehicle? We know they're going to be ride shared, and we know they're going to be, a lot of situations where you're not going to necessarily own these things, and you're going to call it, and it's going to come like an Uber or a Lyft model, and you're going to have to go out and find it. But now there's no longer a human. So if I call my Uber, I'll text them and say, hey, call, I'm not going to see you, so yell for me when you get there. Well, now there's no longer a human driver to kind of get you the last meter problem we're thinking about, to kind of get you to the car, or to let you know, hey, there's a hydrant between you and where the car is parked. And so that's what this project is kind of saying. If we're going to make an end-to-end system that will make these vehicles accessible to people with low vision, older adults who have the highest percentage of low vision, but also have a lot of driving risks, these are the populations that are the most benefit from these things, but how are we going to make them accessible? It's not just doing in the car, in cabin stuff, but how we figure out how to find the car and how the car communicates with us that it's the right car, and then how the vehicle might tell you how to get to your destination once it's dropped you off. So that's what got us into this. And I'll stop because otherwise I'll prattle on for longer than you
No,
already want.
that's fascinating. And Paul, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this?
Yeah, so my name is Paul Fink. I'm a graduate researcher at the VEMI Lab and Nick's doctoral student at the University of Maine. And I got into accessibility research because I took a course with Nick and just realized how much room there is for technology to be a force for good. And I just wanted to be involved in that research immediately. So here I am.
It's fantastic. And
But
Nick,
don't Paul's driven a huge amount of the focus of this research. It's not to be underestimated here. He's being modest.
and Nick, you gave us kind of an overview of the topic that the project is trying to address. But could you give us kind of a broader look at your inclusive design challenge proposal? What accessibility challenge is it addressing, and how does the design of the system work?
Absolutely. So we're addressing the simple problem, which turns out isn't actually that simple, of how a user will summon or call a ride-shared autonomous vehicle to wherever they are, and how that person will then go out and find the vehicle and enter it. And we want this to be done safely, efficiently, and seamlessly. And so there's a bunch of processes that are involved here, and I'll turn it over to Paul and let him kind of walk through a little bit of how it would work.
Yeah, so our inclusive design project is entitled AVA, which is an autonomous vehicle assistant, essentially. It's an application that is helping people who are blind or who have visual impairments, older adults, and really everybody else successfully not only order a vehicle, but also navigate to it and identify which vehicle is actually theirs. We're doing that through a series of technology. We're using computer vision as well as a new set of natural language processes that we're calling natural language navigation. This is in collaboration with our partners at Colby College and Northeastern University. And we're thinking that this suite of technology that's going to be able to run on people's existing smartphone devices is going to be really life-changing for people when a lot of these vehicles end up looking a lot alike. If you can imagine what it's like today, if you've ever ordered an Uber or a Lyft at an airport, really the only way of knowing which car is yours is when the driver rolls down the window and says, "Hey, Paul or Nick, your car's here." And the question we're trying to answer is, how can we make that work when there's no longer a human at the wheel? So incorporating these new technologies is really going to make a difference, not only for people who have visual impairments, but for everyone.
Absolutely. And Paul, you touched on this a little bit, but I was going to ask, who have you partnered with on this project, and what have they helped bring to the table?
Yeah, so this is a group of people that we all kind of have distinct inputs here. So we at VMI are working a lot on the accessible technology, the back end of the app, working with stakeholders. We have some strong connections with an advisory board that's connected to the blindness and older adult transportation field and in those areas. But we also are interested in this natural language navigation module, which is going to be ways of dynamically providing linguistic descriptions. And our colleague Stacy Dorr at Colby has done a lot of work with natural language and navigation. And another key part of this, Paul hinted at this a little bit, are what we're calling compensatory augmentation. So how we can augment the environment of potential risks or potential hazards in a multisensory kind of bio-inspired way that will help people. So imagine there's a hydrant, before where the car stops, or a step that the car's a little away from the curb. Those are things that are very hard for someone with low vision or no vision to see, or perhaps to detect. And so what we're using computer vision to detect these things and then to highlight them. So a lot of people, older adults, have some vision, but they have low contrast sensitivity has gone down. So if we can superimpose a high contrast line on that curb, or highlight the edge of that fire hydrant, and ultimately we want to highlight the car itself and let them see where the handle is, that will be helpful for someone that has low vision. We can also do that with sound and vibration. So when you're getting near the curb, the phone will vibrate. We've done a lot of work in the lab with using vibration to convey spatial cues and map information and hazard information. We can use auditory signals. So we're trying to take this computer vision input with our colleague, Shelley Lynn at Northeastern, and figuring out different multisensory ways to convey that information that you would normally get visually to help with hazard and kind of safe detection and entry to the car.
That's great. And I know a project of this magnitude can't be always easy, and like you mentioned, it can be a little difficult sometimes. So I'm curious, as you've done this work for your project proposal, what would you say is the most important lesson or the most challenging aspect you've had as you've gone through the process?
I'll speak, at least for me, it's practicing what you preach. So it's easy to talk about these things and think you know the answers, but you need to reach out to stakeholders, reach out to end users. We started this project, Paul and I did some interviews with a bunch of blind users and got a lot of input on the things that they were concerned about. And, I thought I could identify most of these things. And one of the beautiful aspects of doing customer discovery, which really something like this should be driven by the end users. You find out what really other people are thinking. You get out of your own subjective way of, thinking, And so we figured out a lot of the issues that we hadn't realized that were important. And to me, that was a challenge in a lot of ways, because you want to just start developing and start designing. And really what you need to do is talk to the people, the end users, the stakeholders, and let them be intimately involved in that iterative process. And I think that's been hard, but it's also been really good. It's why I think we're going to succeed at this.
And Paul, what would you say the most important lesson you've learned is?
Yeah, I would piggyback on what Nick's saying in terms of when we're having these conversations with potential users, we're asking them what their current experience is like with Uber and Lyft, and just asking them to imagine what something that they haven't had a chance yet to imagine will be like. So I would say while we are really committed to making our solution driven by input from stakeholders on our advisory board and also potential end users, it has been challenging to some extent to really sort of predict what all the problems will be and to proactively come up with solutions. But thus far, I would say I'm pretty confident that we're doing a good job.
That's great. And Nick, thinking about the timeline of this project as it continues, what would you say is your ultimate aspiration or goal? What sort of impact do you think is possible and would you like to see?
Ultimately, like when the project's done?
Yeah.
So we'd love to have a working app that is not only able to, communicate with the user and the vehicle, but to provide real-time information that's something that can actually be implemented. We don't need a huge amount of buy-in from, technology that needs to be installed in these vehicles. There obviously needs to be some communication between the person and their phone in the car, the vehicle. But this is something that is really doable. It's able to be implemented on platforms that are already accepted by the vast majority of blind users, because there's a lot of accessibility. There's a lot of inclusive design that's built into the interfaces that we're using. And so I think that, what I want to see is something that actually can ultimately get out there and be used and start being tested with vehicles in real scenarios.
Absolutely. And then is there anything else you'd like, people to help understand about your proposal, the challenge you're addressing, AVA in general, any other final things to add? Paul?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's been maybe not brought up in this conversation has been our commitment to also using the app as a training tool for people with visual impairments in collaboration with their orientation and mobility instructors. So we don't want to just create an app and throw it out into the wild and have maybe some negative consequences arise. Rather, we're really scaffolding the development with an informative process, not only with users, but also with the people who will be helping them learn how to use the technology. So I think that's kind of a safeguard that we're putting in place that will also be enormously beneficial, given that this sort of mobility training is something that the blind community already engages with.
And just building on that a little bit, it's a really important aspect of this that, as Paul said, we hadn't mentioned. What will make this work, though, is if, to get input from not just at the beginning from users and stakeholders and O&M instructors and teachers, but having them continue to give us input as we develop. So people that are, come across this, this interview, if you are interested in being involved, to get in contact with the lab and put your name in there so we can reach out. The more people we can talk to, the more people we can bounce ideas off of, the more people that we can beta test with stuff, the better it will be. And and that's what we're really hoping to generate, this broad-based interest, grassroots, not just in the product, but in the development.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Paul and Nick, for joining us today and sharing your story. And congratulations again on being selected as semifinalists.
We're really excited. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.